Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this video we'll talk about how to safely operate in mountainous areas. Flying in the mountains can provide some of the most spectacular scenery in Microsoft Flight Simulator, but flying in these areas of the world also poses unique risks. So we'll talk about the procedures and techniques you should use to safely fly in mountainous areas. So what exactly is considered a mountainous area? The FAA has their own designation for what they consider a mountainous area. It defines a mountainous area as an area where the elevation changes by more than 3,000 feet within 10 nautical miles, and they have a map available in the Airman's Information Manual showing where in the U.S. these areas are. This definition includes the Appalachian Mountains that stretch from northern Georgia to Maine, but most pilots don't consider flying in this area to be true mountain flying. Yes, there is rapidly rising terrain in these mountains, and it's wise to be aware of that and use caution, but the elevations in this range are much lower than they are out west. The highest peak in the Appalachians, Mount Mitchell, northwest of Asheville, North Carolina, tops out at 6,684 feet, low enough that even the mighty Cessna 152 can safely top it with minimal effort. And most field elevations in the range are below 3,000 feet, low enough that you won't typically even need to lean your mixture for takeoff. The highest public use airport in the chain is Ingalls Field in Healing Springs, Virginia, which is north of Roanoke. It sits at 3,793 feet, just a few hundred feet higher than Colorado's lowest elevation airport. And Ingalls Field is on top of a mountain, whereas most of Colorado's airports are in mountain valleys or in the eastern plains. So for the purposes of this video, we'll be talking about areas of the U.S. that have terrain above 10,000 feet that rises rapidly in close proximity to the airport, and that also have field elevations high enough to significantly affect aircraft performance, generally above about 6,000 feet or so. In the U.S., this type of terrain is found primarily in the western U.S., with the Rocky Mountains covering a significant portion of the states of Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The Sierra Nevadas cover much of California, with several minor ranges keeping the elevations and terrain relatively high in much of the West. Of these areas, Colorado has the highest concentration of high elevation airports and high terrain, with the highest elevation public use airport in the U.S., Lake County Airport in Leadville, located in the state. But the states of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, and California all have areas of high terrain and high elevation airports. Let's take a closer look. Taking a very broad overview of the sectional charts, you can see the darker brown and reddish brown colors are where the high terrain is. So this is Denver over here, and so you've got this big area of high terrain that is to the west of the Denver, Colorado Springs area. Pretty much covers the entire portion of the state of Colorado right here, and it extends down into New Mexico and a little bit up into Wyoming. We also have an area of high terrain over just to the west of, just to the east of Salt Lake, and then some terrain extending down to the southwest there. You also have an area of high terrain over on the northwest corner of Wyoming. This is Jackson Hole right over here, and then you have high terrain also north of that and extending up to the northwest into Idaho. You can see you have some high terrain heading off into Washington, but it is generally going to be lower than what you have over here in the Rocky Mountain area. You also have some areas of high terrain over here in southern and southwest New Mexico and Arizona, a little bit lower than what you have in the rest of this range over here, but still a little bit of high terrain there. And then you have some minor ranges here between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. And then the other big mountain range that we have in the United States is the Sierra Nevadas, but it is not nearly as long as the Rockies, and it is as high. It actually has a higher peak than the Rockies do. But it's about the same elevation. The big difference is there are not quite as many airports located at high elevations in this area. And zooming in on just Colorado here for a second, we'll show you the big difference between Colorado and the Colorado Rockies and the rest of the places that we talk about is that most of the airports in Colorado and in the Colorado Rockies are located at high elevations and actually in the terrain, whereas in a lot of other areas where you have high terrain, like California, there are a few airports that are in the terrain or up at high elevations, up around 7,000 feet. There are not many that are above 7,000 to 8,000 feet. And I don't think there are any that are above 9,000 feet outside of the state of Colorado. So this is where you're going to find the highest concentration of high elevation airports and high terrain is in this area that's just to the west of Denver, Colorado Springs area and goes about 120 miles off to the west in the state of Colorado. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm shirking Alaska or Hawaii. They both have some high terrain, higher than the continental U.S. in the case of Alaska, but in both cases, it's fairly easy to navigate over or around these areas, and neither state has many airports located in the terrain and at high elevations. So what's different about operating out of high elevation airports? One of the primary challenges in operating out of high elevation airports is that the aircraft's performance will be much lower than at an airport closer to sea level. Impacts on aircraft performance you can expect at high elevation airports include reduced acceleration, increased takeoff distances, decreased climb rates, and increased landing distances. There are a few reasons for this. First, the air is thinner at high elevations than it is at sea level. This means that there is more space between air molecules at high elevations, so for a given volume of air, there are fewer molecules in it. Because aircraft engines, both the piston-driven type and turbine or jet engines, need air molecules to create combustion, and there are fewer of them in a given volume of air, the engine produces less power. In addition to physically turning slower, that slower turning propeller or fan blade is moving fewer air molecules than it would be at the same speed at a lower altitude, producing even less thrust. The thin air also produces less lift as it travels over the wings. The result is an aircraft that has reduced performance compared to an aircraft operated near sea level. Compounding this problem is a phenomenon called density altitude. If you look in an aviation textbook, the definition of density altitude is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. Well, what does that mean? If we're taking off from the highest airport in the U.S. in Leadville, Colorado, we know that the elevation of the field is 9,934 feet, which is already pretty thin air that will cause our aircraft to perform poorly. But if the temperature is warmer than standard, the air will get even thinner and less dense, causing our aircraft to perform like it's operating at an even higher altitude. This is what's meant by high density altitude. Low barometric pressure can also cause the air to be less dense, but pressure doesn't typically vary as much as temperature does. To understand density altitude, first let's talk about temperatures and what's considered warmer than standard. The standard temperature, or International Standard Atmosphere, abbreviated ISA or ISA, is 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. This isn't exactly warm, and this is the standard temperature at sea level. In the standard atmosphere, the temperature decreases at 2 degrees C per 1,000 feet, which means the standard temperature at 10,000 feet, about the elevation of Leadville, would be about -5 degrees C or about 23 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that if the temperature is warmer than -5 degrees C in Leadville, the density altitude, or the altitude the aircraft will perform like it's operating at, will be higher than field elevation, and your performance will be further degraded. For reference, high temperatures in the summer in Leadville tend to run close to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 21 degrees Celsius, which is about 26 degrees warmer than standard. The record high temperature in Leadville was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 29 degrees Celsius, a whopping 34 degrees above standard. Let's do some calculations to see how that would affect our density altitude. So I just Googled for a density altitude calculator and came back with this density altitude calculator at e6b.com if you want to check it out. It's a pretty simple calculator. All you do is enter your data and it produces the results for you. So the first field you want to enter is the barometric pressure. We'll just assume that we're doing a standard barometric pressure day, so 2992 on the barometric pressure. Then you enter your field elevation. So for Leadville, that's going to be 9,934 feet. And of course, at standard barometric pressure, our pressure altitude is going to be the same as our actual altitude. We can actually see how barometric pressure decreases will affect this. This is actually the altimeter setting on the field. So let's assume that it's 2952, which is a very low barometric pressure. And you can see it only raises up the pressure altitude about 400 feet. It's very rare that you would see a barometric pressure this low in the mountains. Usually you only see pressures this low inside of pretty strong storms. So this is not going to have a huge effect on density altitude. So we'll go back to our standard barometric pressure setting. And then it asks for our temperature. It tells us what the standard is. We already know it's pretty close to 5 degrees C at Leadville. So let's enter our temperature now. Let's assume that we have an average summer day at the high temperature of the day. So we'll say it's 21 degrees C. Whoops, not 211. And it tells us that the pressure altitude, excuse me, the density altitude is going to be 12,984 feet, or almost 13,000 feet, which means that the aircraft is going to perform like it's taking off from a field that's located at 13,000 feet. Your performance is going to be very poor. Now let's assume that we're operating on a very warm day, an unusually warm day. Let's say that we have the same temperature that they had on the day they set the record high in Leadville, 29 degrees Celsius, or about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see this raises our density altitude to 13,934 feet, or almost 14,000 feet. This means that our aircraft is going to be taking off and performing like it's launching from a field that's at 14,000 feet above sea level. For reference, the service ceiling on the Cessna 172, or the altitude at which you cannot guarantee that the aircraft will climb at more than 100 feet per minute, is 14,000 feet per the manual. This means that your aircraft may not be able to get airborne or climb once it's airborne at this density altitude. Density altitude is one of the primary reasons that real-world mountain pilots tend to fly in the morning when the density altitude is lower, although they also do so because thunderstorms tend to crop up over the mountains every afternoon in the summer on a regular basis. Also compounding our performance problem is the increase in true airspeed at higher altitudes. You might remember from some of our first videos that true airspeed increases for a given indicated airspeed as your altitude increases. A good rule of thumb is that for every 1,000 feet above sea level, your true airspeed increases about 2% over your indicated airspeed. So when you're flying in and out of airports at elevations above 7,000 feet, you'll be flying 15 to 20% faster through the air and over the ground than you're used to at lower elevation airports. You still want to fly the speeds listed in your aircraft's manual for all phases of flight, but you need to be aware that your true airspeed and thus your ground speed will be quite a bit higher than what you're used to near sea level. For example, in the 172, if you're on approach into Leadville, which again is at nearly 10,000 feet of elevation, your 70 knot indicated approach speed equates to about 86 knots over the ground in a no-wind condition. And high-performance aircraft like Beechcraft and Cirrus can be traveling at well over 100 knots across the ground. This increases your landing distance, can increase the amount of brake effort you need to apply, and can heat up your brakes. So let's dig into the charts a little to see the specific impact altitude is going to have on our aircraft performance. So the first chart that we'll take a look at is the takeoff distance for the 172 at max gross weight, or at 2,550 pounds. We'll compare the takeoff distance at sea level to the takeoff distance at 8,000 feet. Notice these are 8,000 feet numbers, not 10,000 feet numbers. So this is not the performance we would get out of Leadville. This is a little bit better than what we can do out of Leadville. Let's take a look at a 20-degree day, and this is the temperature at field elevation, so you don't have to make any sort of correction for that. And our ground roll at sea level is going to be 995 feet. So just over or just under 1,000 feet of pavement that we need to get the aircraft more airborne at sea level, versus at 8,000 feet we need a little over 2,000 feet of pavement to get the aircraft airborne. So a little over twice as much at this higher elevation to get the aircraft airborne. Similarly, our total distance that we need to clear a 50-foot obstacle is 1,690 at sea level, versus at the same temperature at 8,000 feet, we need almost 4,000 feet to clear a 50-foot obstacle. So again, more than twice as much distance needed at these high elevations. That gives you an idea of how big the impact is on performance of the aircraft is elevation. Another thing I want to take a look at, first of all, let's take a look at a reduction in temperature. If we decrease the temperature from 20 degrees C to 0 degrees C, we can see that we do get an increase in performance, but it is not a major increase. It's not a dramatic increase in performance. We go from needing 2120 feet to needing 1820, so about a 300-foot gain there. And it's a very similar gain in the distance needed to clear a 50-foot obstacle. Something that does have a big impact is the amount of weight you put on the airplane. So let's take a look at the chart for the 172 at 2,200 pounds, or about 350 pounds under max gross weight. You'll notice for the same temperature and same elevation, our ground roll is now 1,475 versus 2,120. So down to under 1,500 feet from over 2,000 feet, a pretty dramatic reduction. And same thing for our distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle, 2,555 versus almost 4,000 feet. So the takeaway from this, if you are flying in the mountains with a general aviation aircraft, most mountain pilots will tell you that they do not fly their aircraft in the mountains at more than 80% of its certified gross weight, just to get that increase in performance. For most general aviation aircraft, this is going to mean two things. First, it's going to mean that you're going to be able to carry one less passenger. For example, the 140 or the 172 we always say is a 4-seat aircraft, but a 3-place aircraft, and if we're not in the mountains, meaning we can only carry really 3 passengers before we have to start scrimping on fuel. In the mountains, really it gets down to being a 2-passenger aircraft to be able to have adequate performance. The other thing that you want to look at with this is that you want to, as the mountain pilots say, fuel for the mission. They will generally put enough fuel to accomplish the flight that they plan to accomplish, plus an adequate reserve, and they will not top off the tank, so that will save them some weight on the fuel. The next chart we'll take a look at is the rate of climb at max gross weight, just comparing at sea level on a 20-degree C day. Normally we're going to get about 700 feet per minute out of the aircraft if we take off out of sea level, versus if we're at Leadville at that 20 degrees C day, which again is only about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, we're only going to be getting about 240 feet a minute. And if our density altitude is higher than that, you can see we can get down to where we are barely climbing. And if it's hot at 12,000 feet, the aircraft is not guaranteed to climb. So this gives you an idea of the dramatic difference in climb rate that you're going to see at high elevation airports and climbing in high altitudes. And finally, we'll take a look at the landing performance charts, and you'll notice that the difference isn't as dramatic with these distances. Basically, the only thing that's at play here is your higher true airspeed, your lack of acceleration, and your lack of climbing ability, and your lack of engine power is not going to be a factor on the landings, but your higher true airspeed is. So at sea level, at a 20 degrees C day at sea level, we're going to get a takeoff roll, or the amount of pavement we need to get the aircraft stopped is 585 feet. And at 8,000 feet, it's going to be just shy of 800 feet. So not a dramatic difference, but there is an increase there. Same thing for clearing a 50-foot obstacle, 1350 at sea level versus 1670. Not a huge increase, only about 300 feet. But when you get into higher performance aircraft, this difference is going to be a little bit larger. And since they already are traveling faster and need more room to stop, you need to check the charts when you're going into a field at those elevations to make sure that it is of adequate length for you to get the aircraft stopped. So to set up for some mountain flying procedure demos here, we are going to use the Textron Cessna 172 Skyhawk. Mostly we'll be using the G1000 edition. So we've got that aircraft selected. Weight and balance, I put on fuel, 2 full tanks of gas and 2 passengers, and that keeps us well under max gross weight, which is a good idea when you're flying in the mountains. We will do the demos out of Leadville, so KLXV is the identifier there, and we will zoom to details here, and we'll start actually on the ramp. The main ramp is right over here, so we'll go ahead and select one of those parking spots to do a startup demo. And then as far as the time, I'm going to do a mid-June day. That'll give us, that's best time of year for flying in the mountains is typically the summertime. Otherwise, you are dealing with some snow and things like that. We'll start about 10 o'clock in the morning. We'll go ahead and get set up for that, and then we will crank up and talk about setting up the weather. As far as setting the weather up for our flight, we are on the ramp here at Leadville. So before we get started, I'll go ahead and set up the weather. I'm going to go ahead and delete the wind, so we do have calm winds. And then I'm going to change the altitude calculation from AMGL, which is above mean ground level, to AMSL, which is above mean sea level. If you have it above ground level, the problem that you run into is it sets your temperature at whatever level the ground is, wherever you are. And in mountainous territory, what that means is that temperature is basically going to contour to wherever the ground level is. So if I'm at sea level and I have it set at 15 degrees C or about 59 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit, at sea level it will be 15 degrees Celsius. At Denver, 5,000 feet, it will be 15 degrees Celsius. Here on the ramp at Leadville, it will be 15 degrees Celsius, and up over there on the top of Mount Elbert at 14,000 feet, it will also be 15 degrees Celsius. And then the lapse rate will not work correctly. You're going to get very warm air over the top of mountains, very cold air when you fly over lower terrain. So in order to do that, I just set it up with above mean sea level, and then I take a look at my aircraft temperature gauge here. Almost every aircraft has a temperature gauge in it, and then I set it up to a temperature that I want to set it to. So I'll set it at about 10 degrees C. I'm not even looking at the weather window. I'm just looking at the temperature over here on my aircraft temperature gauge, and I just move it until I get the temperature I want at this particular elevation. So about 10 degrees C should work. I've got clear skies. Again, I got rid of the winds, standard pressure, and that should be a good day for mountain flying up here in Leadville. All right, so I could go ahead and go through my before start checklist and flow. So I've got the parking brake set. The fuel tank selector is on both. The fuel shutoff valve is open. The mixture, we do not want full rich, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. The nav lights are on. The beacons are on. The standby battery we tested, and it's now to arm. And the master battery switch is on. G1000 display looks okay. So the thing that we don't want to do up here is we don't want to start it with a mixture full rich. You can see when I do that, it will start, but then the mixture is so rich it literally chokes off the engine and shuts down again. So I don't have anything scientific to tell you here, and there's nothing really in the manual. Again, we're using a slightly different start procedure than what the book tells us to do. But what I would say is pull your mixture out at probably elevations above 7,000 feet. Probably pull it out about halfway. So there's full range of travel there. So about halfway would be about right there. And then if you are probably, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, maybe do it about a third of the way. And then you'll notice if we do that, the engine will start on up and it will stay running. So we do need a little leaner mixture to get it started at these high elevations. Then we'll go out and we'll do a full engine run up. We'll actually do a full power run up to get the mixture set to the appropriate amount of lean. that we're going to need to get maximum power for taking off here in the mountains. All right, so we've taxied up and we're holding short of runway 16 in Leadville. I'll mention about taxiing that it's really not that much different than taxiing at a lower elevation airport, except that you may need a little more throttle than you're used to get the airplane moving, and you may need a little more throttle to keep it moving. But other than that, the airplane will taxi exactly the same as it does at a lower elevation. A couple of quirks I want to mention in Flight Simulator about the mixture. The first one is that if you spawn onto the runway or you spawn in flight at a higher elevation in Flight Simulator, a higher altitude, it will automatically set the mixture for you. It won't set it as precisely as you can set it yourself, but it will actually lean out the mixture to about the right place that it should be for that altitude. The other thing that's a little bit weird of a quirk is if you slew the aircraft and you place it on the ground at a high elevation airport, whenever you release the slew, it will reset the mixture to full rich, which of course at a high elevation airport, that's going to choke your engine and kill it. So be aware of that if you slew your aircraft whenever you release it. Make sure it be full rich and your engine's going to die if you don't lean it out real quickly. All right, so again, we're short of runway 16 in Leadville. We'll do our run-up. It will be a full power run-up. That is what the Cessna manual dictates, and I believe that's what you want to do in any airplane that you need to lean at a high elevation airport. We're going to use the RPM drop method to lean it. And again, it doesn't matter really if you're flying an engine with a variable pitch propeller that has a manifold pressure gauge. When you're leaning it on the ground, you still want to lean for that max RPM. In real life, you want to make sure you're at an area where you're not going to be blasting people with your prop blast, so generally you're going to be short of the runway, or if they have a designated run-up area, you want to use that. Generally doing it on the ramp is not a great idea, and again, we're just short of the runway. So we'll go ahead and make sure the parking brake is set so we don't roll off, and then we'll go ahead and bring up the throttle to full throttle all the way in. And you notice we're getting about 2180 on the RPMs, and then I will start to lean the mixture out very slowly, and notice our RPMs are coming up. Now that we've got 2200, I'll keep leaning it. Now we're down to 2290. So what we're looking for is max RPMs, and it looks like 2200 at this altitude and this temperature. 2210 now is going to be where we need to be. So just bring your throttle to full throttle, and then lean the mixture until you get that maximum RPM. And if it starts to drop, then richen it back up. And that should be what we need for takeoff and for operating. Once you get airborne, once you get above 1,000 feet above the ground, you'll probably want to tweak that mixture just a little bit and then lean it off and cruise again, just like you would in a normal flight. But that's how to do your run-up and lean the mixture for high altitude flights. So before we perform a takeoff at a high elevation airport, let's take a look at some of the considerations we need to think about before doing a takeoff at a high elevation airport. First of all, we need to lean the mixture for max RPM prior to takeoff, which we just talked about. Then expect a reduced acceleration on takeoff roll. The aircraft is going to be a little sluggish in getting going. Expect a longer takeoff roll. You should have some idea of how long it's going to take by looking at the performance charts, but know that you're going to be on the runway a lot longer than you're used to at sea level. Rotate at your normal VR speed. Be aware that liftoff may be delayed. You may rotate to that takeoff pitch attitude and then stay there for 3 to 5 seconds before the aircraft finally decides to get airborne. If you don't lift off within about 5 to 10 seconds of rotation, you may need to consider that takeoff may need to be aborted. It depends on how much runway you have in front of you, but if the airplane is just sitting there in the pitch attitude and not lifting off for more than about 5 or 10 seconds, you may have a high enough density altitude that the aircraft is not going to lift off, so you may need to abort the takeoff. You made a slightly lower than normal pitch attitude for both rotation and the initial climb out in Flight Simulator. I don't believe this is a thing in real life, but in Flight Sim I've noticed that if you rotate to 10 degrees, it will start to decelerate once it gets airborne. So you may need to pitch instead of 10 degrees for the 172, it may be just a little bit above 5 degrees. Use normal V speeds for climb out, but be aware that you may need to use VX until you're safely clear of all terrain. And then the mountains, that may mean that you need to climb at VX for a longer time than you're used to climbing at VX in lower terrain. All right, so we're lined up on runway 16, so we'll go ahead and perform a normal takeoff. I'll go ahead and bring the throttle to full. And notice how slow the aircraft is to accelerate. You can keep your eye on the ground speed and the true airspeed, and notice that it's going to take us a lot longer to get airborne. The airspeed hasn't even come alive yet. We're almost to the 1,000-foot markers there. We've hit about 40 knots of ground speed now. Airspeed's come alive. Notice how much higher my ground speed and my true airspeed is. Again, we just want to rotate or accelerate to that rotation speed. We're just going to have to spend a lot longer time on the ground at this high altitude. So there is VR, so I'll go ahead and rotate. And it seems like about 5 degrees or so. You notice if I pitch much more than that, the aircraft starts to slow down. So I'm going to pitch for about 5 degrees. I do have flaps 10. I'm at VX, so I'm just going to pitch to maintain VX right now until I get good and clear of that terrain that's up in front of me. And look at our initial climb rate. Right now we're doing about 250 feet a minute, whereas at sea level we'd be doing, you know, somewhere between 600 and 800 feet per minute. If you need to, you can make a very shallow turn to turn towards lower terrain if your climb rate is not that great. Again, I'm going to hold VX until I'm good and clear of that terrain. Alright, looks like I've got a reasonable amount of distance between myself and the terrain. So I'll go ahead and pull those flaps up, and I'll hold just under 5 degrees to let it accelerate to VY of 74 knots. And then I'll maintain that VY. Notice I'm almost not climbing at all while I'm allowing it to accelerate. Airport's at about 10,000 feet. I'm just coming up on 10,200, so I've barely gained 200 feet of altitude at this point. It'll start climbing a little bit better once I've reached VY, but yeah, it's very slow. Now we're getting up to about 500 feet per minute, feeling a little bit better, but we still can't pitch up to that normal pitch attitude of 10 degrees. So that's how a takeoff differs in the mountainous areas at a high altitude field. And you obviously, if you had terrain directly in front of you, you know, this could be a bit of a challenge with these climb rates. Let's take a look at a video that will show you kind of the difference between what a normal takeoff looks like at a sea level elevation airport and at Leadville at 10,000 feet. So let's take a look at some footage that's going to show us a simultaneous takeoff of an aircraft that is located near sea level and an aircraft that is taking off from Leadville at nearly 10,000 feet. So the bottom screen is going to show you the takeoff with the aircraft that's at Pine Bluff, which is about 205 feet above sea level, so pretty close to sea level. And the top screen will show you an aircraft that's taking off from Leadville at 9,934 feet, so nearly 10,000 feet. Other than the altitude, the only difference will be temperature. The bottom aircraft will be taking off at a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius or about 59 degrees Fahrenheit, which is ISO standard. And the top aircraft is going to be taking off at a temperature of 10 degrees at Leadville or about 50 degrees, which is a pretty typical temperature for a mid-morning in Leadville in the summertime, though it is quite a bit above the ISO standard, so our density altitude will also be a bit higher than the field elevation. Other than that, the weather conditions are going to be the same in terms of barometric pressure and wind, and the aircraft are exactly the same. It's a 172S with the G1000 on board in both cases, and the weight and balance is set exactly the same. So we have the same amount of fuel and the same amount of payload on both aircraft. Notice how the aircraft accelerate once power is applied. They will apply it nearly simultaneously. And notice how much slower the one on the top is going to accelerate. Then notice how much more quickly the aircraft on the bottom gets airborne, and then how much higher its climb rate is. And then take a comparison on when the two aircraft reach a certain height above the airport elevation compared to each other. I think you'll agree this serves as a pretty dramatic demonstration of the differences in performance between takeoff at sea level and high elevations. As you level off at high altitude, you'll notice that your acceleration to your cruise airspeed will be slower, and you may cruise at an airspeed significantly lower than what you're used to at lower altitudes. Your true airspeed should be similar to what you're used to at lower altitudes though, so you can use that as a gauge for where your cruise airspeed should be if your aircraft is equipped with a true airspeed readout. In an aircraft equipped with a fixed pitch propeller, you likely need to set a higher RPM than you would at lower altitudes, and it may be near or at full throttle. The best technique is to set cruise power based on the data from the cruise performance charts in the aircraft manual if you have one available, and this should give you fairly predictable performance. For example, we're in the Cessna 172S, the G1000 edition. I am level at 12,500 feet. The temperature is 5 degrees up here. I set it for 10 degrees C when I took off from Leadville. And you can see I've got the cruise RPM set to 2,500. And if we look at the throttle, that is very nearly full throttle. If I can't put in the throttle much more than that, I get about 20, 30, 40 or more RPM. So I'm pretty close to full throttle already. And you notice that my cruise airspeed is only about 90 knots of indicated airspeed, which is a lot slower than I'm used to. Usually you get about 105, maybe 110 at lower altitudes. But you can see that the true airspeed is 114 knots, which is pretty comparable to what I get at those lower altitudes. So that's what's going to be a little bit different about the cruise in a fixed pitch propeller. In an aircraft with a variable pitch or constant speed prop, your manifold pressure will drop as your altitude increases, and at altitudes above 8,000 feet, you'll need to maintain full throttle even at cruise, and you'll still get a lower manifold pressure than you're used to getting at a lower altitude. After you level off, you want to go ahead and set your prop RPM to the RPM recommended in the aircraft manual, and maintain full throttle if the manifold pressure is at or normal cruise setting. Like the fixed pitch prop, you may get a lower indicated airspeed, but your true airspeed should be comparable to what you get at lower altitudes. So we're level at 12,500 just south of Leadville in the Bonanza G36 the Beechcraft G36 Bonanza. And you can see I've got my manifold pressure set at 18.6 inches, which is quite a bit lower than what I'm used to getting at a lower altitude. Usually it's up around 23 to 25 inches for cruise, but you can see I have the throttle all the way in, and all I'm going to get is 18.6 inches up here at 12,500 feet. I do have the prop RPM set to 2,400, which is one of the settings that's recommended in the Pilot Operation Handbook. And you can see that I am getting 130 knots of indicated airspeed, which is quite a bit lower than what we're used to getting at lower altitudes. But again, my true airspeed is about what it should be. It's about 160 knots of true airspeed. So that is how you want to set up a variable pitch prop. Just know that your manifold pressure is going to be quite a bit lower than you're used to, and you're probably going to need to maintain full throttle and just be at a lower manifold pressure setting even in cruise. In all aircraft, just be cognizant of your margin from your stall speed, particularly in non-turbocharged or non-turbine aircraft. If you're cruising at a speed that's not far from your stall speed, you're likely on the edge or potentially outside of your aircraft's performance envelope, and you may need to consider descending to a lower altitude. Also remember to lean your mixture again in cruise in an aircraft that has a mixture control, and be cognizant that you may need to lean the mixture in the climb to get your best power in your climb. It kind of depends on how much you're climbing and how long you're climbing, how much altitude you're gaining, but you may want to consider leaning that mixture in the climb if you're going more than about 4,000 feet between your takeoff altitude and your cruise altitude. So here are some things we need to think about before we make an approach and landing at a high elevation airport. First of all, you want to use the normal V speeds for approach that are listed in your aircraft's manual. You don't want to change these speeds at all because you're making an approach in mountainous terrain or high elevation airport. Just use the normal V speeds in the book. Second, be aware that you may require a slightly higher power setting to maintain these speeds and the glide path than at lower elevation airports. You may find that your RPM setting or your manifold pressure setting is just a little bit higher than what you're used to when you make an approach at sea level. Be aware that your true airspeed and ground speed will be about 15 to 20% higher than it is in sea levels, so you will be looking like you're traveling a little faster over the ground because you are. Carefully check your field length requirements before the approach. Again, because of that higher true airspeed and higher ground speed, you're going to require a little more length than you would need at a sea level elevation airport. So check that and make sure that you have enough pavement to get the aircraft stopped. Consider using short field technique if the field is within 1,000 feet of the minimum required runway length that you need to get the aircraft stopped at that elevation. And be aware that this is going to be a little higher than what you're used to at sea level. So you're going to be using short field technique at runways that are a little bit longer than what you would use short field technique for at a lower elevation airport. Be aware that the aircraft may sink faster if power is reduced. If you pull the power to idle, your sink rate may be quite a bit higher than what you're used to at sea level. Use your normal round out and flare technique. There's no reason to change this. You may want to bring the power out just a little bit slower depending on how your approach was flown, if it's flown at a normal height, but just use your normal round out and flare technique. Be aware that once you get on the ground, you may need more braking effort on a short field due to that higher ground speed, particularly, well, if the field is short, then you may need more braking effort. If the field is long enough and you've got plenty of runway remaining, there's no reason to burn up the brakes to get the airplane stopped, but just be aware that on a shorter field, you might need a little more braking effort. Be aware that if you need to go around, that the climb rate when you go around will be greatly reduced when you execute that maneuver. And plan for the terrain during a go-around. Know that your go-around may not be into a normal traffic pattern. You may need to fly a specific route to get around the terrain. And at some airports, you're going to want to make that decision very early because your routes for go-around are going to be very limited. So I'm on approach into Leadville, coming through about 10,600 feet. The first thing I want you to notice, if you look at the panel, is my true airspeed versus my approach speed. I've got the approach speed pretty well nailed, right at about 70, 71 knots, and my true airspeed, and thus my ground speed, is right now 93 knots. So I'm doing nearly 100 miles an hour over the ground right now, even though I'm at the listed approach speed. The other thing to notice is look how much power I'm carrying. Normally about 1900 RPM should be enough to get me on an appropriate glide slope. And you can see right now I'm coming down at about 700 feet per minute because I'm a little high on the glide slope. And I had about 2100 RPM in there to maintain that speed. So those are the things to be aware of on your approach. Your airspeed is going to be higher and you may need a little extra power. And then once you get down on the deck, the flare, round out and flare, all that is pretty normal. But once you get on the ground, because you're going at a higher true airspeed and a higher ground speed, you're going to need a little more length to get the airplane stopped. So we're down on the ground. Go ahead and apply braking. And you can see it's taking a little more runway, not an excessive amount like takeoff where we took up a little over half the runway, but it is taking us a good amount of distance to get the airplane stopped. So those are things you need to be aware of on your approach to a high elevation airport. Airports in the mountainous areas also pose some unique challenges that you might not encounter in the flatlands. Some mountain airports are located on the tops of mesas, which means there may be a large drop-off at each end of the runway, making any overrun a very unpleasant experience. Terrain may dictate a non-standard traffic pattern at many mountain airports, and for some airports, any sort of normal traffic pattern simply won't be possible due to the terrain. Some mountain airports are located at the end of mountain valleys with high terrain on many sides of the airport. At these fields, you may need to approach the airport from a certain direction to get into the valley, and at some airports, it's necessary to land in one direction and take off in the opposite direction. Go-arounds may also be more difficult at these airports. Aspen is a famous example of this. Approaches are always made to runway 15, and departures are always made off of runway 33. This is so you can follow the Roaring Fork River Valley both in and out of the valley, and because high terrain in every area around the airport but the northwest precludes flying in these areas for most aircraft. It's always a good idea to check out the airport facility directory for any special procedures that might be in place at mountain airports you plan to land at. At some mountain airports, you may not be able to take off and head directly on course, particularly if that course takes you over higher terrain. At some airports, you may need to climb along and out of a valley before you can proceed on course, and at others, it may be necessary to circle and climb in the lower terrain area near an airport or valley before you make your way on course over high terrain. It's also not uncommon for runways in mountainous areas to have more of a slope than you're used to, although I don't think anything in the U.S. is as dramatic as the slope in Lukla, Nepal, pictured here. Remember that if a runway is sloping up from the direction you're approaching it from, meaning that the far end is higher than the close end, you'll tend to think your aircraft is higher than you actually are, since you can see more of the runway. The opposite is true of a downsloping runway. Also remember that a downsloping runway will make it harder to stop and increase your landing rollout, since it's harder to stop when you're rolling downhill. For this reason, always try to land upslope if wind and terrain allow. Fortunately, most mountainous airports are built so that that's usually the way you land. Takeoff is the opposite, with an upsloping runway on takeoff reducing your takeoff performance. You also need to be aware that your lack of climb performance will still be an issue if you need to go around during an approach to a mountain airport. At airports of the end of mountain valleys or with other high terrain around the airport, your route options if you need to go around may be reduced or even eliminated. It's very important to establish yourself on a stable approach at these airports, and if you decide you need to go around, initiate that go around as early as possible on the approach and plan the route you'll fly on the go around well in advance. Navigating in the mountains is another area that presents unique challenges. To start with, for general aviation aircraft, almost all mountain flying is done in day VFR conditions. Instrument flying in the mountains is not possible for most GA aircraft, as the minimum IFR altitudes are higher than the service ceilings on most of these aircraft. They're also high enough that oxygen or pressurization would be required, and icing is a threat even during the summer months. Night flying in the mountains is also not a wise idea for light aircraft, as it's difficult to see mountainous terrain at night. There typically aren't any roads or settlements on the high terrain, so there's no man-made lighting up there either, making the mountains pretty much invisible on a dark night. Synthetic vision, like that found on the GE1000, can be used for situational awareness, but should not be used as a primary means of terrain avoidance. Flight planning and being familiar with your route is essential in mountainous areas. Often direct routes are not possible or advisable in mountainous areas. So let's take a look at a sample route. We'll take a look at a route from Del Norte Airport over to Telluride Regional. The identifier on Del Norte is Kilo Romeo Charlie Victor. The identifier for Telluride is Kilo Tango Echo X-ray. And if we were in flat terrain, we would just put this into the GPS or plan a direct route on our flight planner. And it is a straight shot, 75 nautical miles on about a 270 heading. But this is a bad route in the mountains for several reasons. First of all, this has us crossing some very high terrain. We can see that there's a point just to the north of our route that's over 14,000 feet in elevation, which means we'll need to be at least 15,000 feet to fly this route. And really, for right direction of flight VFR, you would need to be at 16.5, which is well above the capabilities of most of the general aviation aircraft in the game. Even if you have an aircraft that can do that, of course, you'll need oxygen up there in the real world as well, or pressurization. But even if you have an aircraft that can do that in a single engine airplane, if you lose the engine over this area, you're going to have very few options as far as suitable landing sites. You're going to be having a lot of not flat areas to set the aircraft down in. And Furthermore, in real life, if you do manage to find a relatively flat area to set the aircraft down in, if you're up at a high elevation, you're going to be exposed to harsher weather, and you're going to be decreasing the chances that any aid can reach you in that high terrain. So if you have a emergency landing that you survive, but you're injured, your odds of getting assistance up there are relatively low. A lot of mountain pilots out there will actually recommend, even if you're flying over relatively benign terrain, since much of it is still very remote and relatively harsh compared to lower elevation areas in the country, they'll recommend that you carry a survival kit in your aircraft anytime you're flying in this area of the country. A better route to take if you were to fly between these two airports in the mountain would be to take off out of Del Norte and follow this highway down to South Fork, and then follow the highway through Wolf Creek Pass. The pass has an elevation of about 11,000 feet, so you only need to get up to about 12,000 feet to cross the pass safely. Then you can follow this highway. It looks like US Highway 160. Over by Pagosa Springs and Durango and Cortez, and then you can head north towards the Cones VOR, and then you can enter the Telluride Valley from the west-northwest. And it does add quite a bit of distance to your route, but in the real world, this would be the much safer route to use. A lot of mountain pilots joke that they always fly IFR, where IFR means I follow roads, rivers, or railroads. It's also not easy to use old-fashioned radio nav aids like VORs and NDBs in the mountainous areas. The terrain often blocks the signals at the altitudes light aircraft can cruise at. GPS should work fine in the mountains, but direct routes often won't work in areas of high terrain for the reasons we just discussed. And even multi-point routes on a GPS may not fly exactly over the optimal route, so you may not be able to couple your autopilot to the GPS like you would in flatter terrain. If I use the autopilot in the mountains, I'll typically just use the GPS course for general guidance, and I'll use the heading mode to keep the aircraft on the optimal path through the terrain. Failure to engage in good flight planning and navigation in the mountains can cause you to steer up the wrong valley and quickly find yourself running out of room and altitude. If you're not sure if you're in the right place or if you can clear the terrain ahead, make the decision to turn back towards lower terrain as early as possible. Then stick to one side of the valley to give yourself the maximum amount of room to make your turn. As you make your turn, be cognizant of your airspeed and diligent not to let it drop below VX. Don't try a steep turn either. Try to keep the bank at or under 30 degrees. Executing a steep turn at low speed in the mountains is the perfect recipe for a stall spin accident. If you need to exceed 30 degrees for some reason, be cognizant of the stall warning signs for your aircraft. If you get any sign of being close to a stall, drop the nose to reduce the load on the wings and accept a little altitude loss to prevent stalling the aircraft due to a high G load. You'll want to cruise at an altitude that keeps you clear of the highest terrain over your route by at least 1,000 feet, and strict adherence to VFR cruise altitudes in the mountains generally isn't necessary, or even possible sometimes. It's also okay to use a higher altitude to cross higher terrain and then descend to a lower altitude once you're clear of it. Also be aware that if your route takes you down a mountain valley or over a mountain pass, there may be terrain on either side of your aircraft that's higher than you are. On some routes through the mountains, you'll have to cruise at an altitude that would necessitate using oxygen in the real world, so it's good to be familiar with those regs, and many real-world mountain pilots advise at least having oxygen on board if you plan to fly above 10,000 feet for a significant amount of time. Most mountain pilots recommend that flatland pilots use oxygen at all times above 10,000 feet, since their bodies are generally not used to being in the thin air above that altitude for prolonged periods of time, and many use it themselves above 10,000 feet. Occasionally, the best route in the mountains may necessitate crossing a mountain pass. A mountain pass is the lowest point in a ridge or mountain range. These can be used to cross a range or ridge more directly than flying around it. They're often where roads or railroads cross that range or tunnel through it, though there's not a road on all mountain passes and some are just dirt roads. So for example of how you would use a mountain pass, let's take a look at a trip from between Lee Vining Airport, which is Oscar 24, over across the Sierra Nevadas to, say, Mariposa Yosemite Airport. This is in the Sierra Nevadas of California. You can see we're just to the south of the Nevada border out here. And you can see if we were to just go fly straight across the terrain, some of this terrain is up at 13,000 feet or higher. So we need to get to at least 14,000, 14,500 to be able to cross that on a direct route. But what we can do instead is we can follow this road, and we can see that this road goes through Tioga Pass. The symbology for a pass is these two little black lines that kind of have a bow in there, and in the middle of those two lines is where the pass is. The lines are also oriented in the direction that the pass is oriented, so you want to traverse this pass either north to south or south to north to clear the terrain. You wouldn't want to try to cross it east-west or west-east. It also, with most passes on sectionals, it also gives the elevation of the pass. This is the elevation of the lowest point on the pass. And as long as you select an altitude that's 500 feet, but preferably at least 1,000 feet above this altitude, you should safely clear all of the terrain in and around the pass with no problem if you stay on this route. You can see this is a much more efficient way to get around the mountains. If we tried to go around all the high terrain, we'd have to go up north of where I have it zoomed in on the section now, or way south of where we have it zoomed in on the sectional now. And if we tried to go over the mountains again, we'd be upwards of 14,000 feet, whereas we can go to just like 11,000 or so to get over Tioga Pass. And then once we're clear, we can start descending once again. When crossing a mountain pass, it's a good idea to approach it at a 45-degree angle if surrounding terrain permits, to make for a shorter turn towards lower elevation if you find that you won't clear the pass. You should plan to cross the pass at least 500 feet, but preferably 1,000 feet above the pass elevation. Mountain passes can have elevations over 12,000 feet, so before you attempt the crossing, be familiar with the pass and make sure your aircraft has the performance to clear it, and give yourself plenty of room to get up to altitude for the crossing. Once you've cleared the pass, take the most direct path towards lowering terrain. Weather is another challenge in mountain flying, although we have a lot more control over this in Flight Simulator than real-life pilots do. Still, you should be cognizant of updrafts and downdrafts in the mountains if you have any wind set. The general flow of wind in the States tends to be roughly west to east. When air reaches the mountains, it flows over and around them a lot like water over rocks in a creek or river. It will flow down the downwind side of the mountain and up the upwind side of the mountain, creating downdrafts and updrafts. They're probably not as strong in flight sim as they can be in real life, but in the real world, in conditions of high winds, these downdrafts can be strong enough to prevent even high-performance aircraft from climbing out of them. In the real world, weather in the mountains can also change quickly and be drastically different across short distances. It's wise to gather your weather information from multiple sources and plan alternates even if the forecast doesn't require them. Again, not something we have to worry about much in flight sim, but something we need to be aware of if using real-world weather. So let's take a look at some of the aircraft you can use for flying in the mountains and how they'll perform. Primary trainers like the Cessna 152 and the Robin DR400-100 Cadet don't make very good mountain flying aircraft. While you can fly them in mountainous areas, you'll likely find it a bit of a challenge with their low power, low climb rate, and limited service ceiling. They may not perform well at the highest elevation fields, particularly on high density altitude days, and may struggle to achieve the altitudes required to tackle the higher mountain passes. All versions of the Cessna 172 in the game have enough performance to handle high elevation fields and high mountain pass crossings, though you will have to plan ahead and make sure your engine is leaned properly. You also have to pay close attention to how heavily the aircraft is loaded. The Diamond singles, which include the DV-20 and both versions of the DA-40, perform quite well in the mountains. They have enough power to handle the high elevation airports, given their light weight, and enough performance to easily climb over the high mountain passes. Plus, the wide bubble canopies give you excellent views of the scenery. The DA-40 is one of my personal favorites to fly in the mountains. Since it has a diesel engine, you won't need to lean it and can be assured it will always be developing the maximum amount of power possible, making it a great aircraft for first-time mountain flyers. The Cub clones, which include the Cub Crafters X Cub and the NX Cub, as well as the Zlin Savage Cub and Shock Ultra, also perform pretty well in the mountains and are good aircraft to use if you want to try any non-paved airports in the mountains. In addition, the Zlin models are equipped with Rotax diesel engines that don't require leaning. High-performance single-engine airplanes like the Beechcraft Bonanza and Cirrus SR-22 will have good performance and adequate service ceilings to fly in the mountains, but their higher approach speeds mean they will use a lot of runway at those fields, so make sure to check your takeoff and landing performance charts and field links before attempting any landing with these aircraft, and make sure you use proper short field technique and fly the recommended speeds precisely if the margins are tight. The same holds true for the light twins in the game like the DA-62 and the Beechcraft Baron, but you also need to be aware that your single-engine performance will be much worse at high elevations and altitudes. You should check your performance charts in these airplanes for the single-engine service ceiling and be aware that your aircraft may not be able to climb on a single engine in high-density altitude conditions. Light turboprops like the Cessna 208, TBM 930, and King Air 350 will also perform well in the mountains and typically have the performance, service ceiling, and de-ice capabilities to fly IFR in the mountains. Just be aware that, with the exception of the Cessna 208, these aircraft will require pretty long runways for takeoff and landings at high elevations. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you some of the knowledge and skills you need to confidently explore some of the mountain regions in the US or in the world. As my mountain flying instructor once told me, mountain flying is much like instrument flying in that it's a form of flying that takes a little more skill and planning than basic point A to point B VFR flying. It's also a type of flying that's immensely rewarding, both with a sense of accomplishment and with the spectacular views you get in the mountains. As always, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.